Welcome to Unmoored, America adrift in historical forgetfulness and finding our way back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
Well, welcome to episode 6 of Unmoored. We've been in some ancient stuff here. The last 2 episodes. Did I lose you?
Listen, I'll tell you what. We talked last episode about Constantine, and I think I learned more about Constantine and Roman history than I ever did in 4 semesters of Latin class. So that was very good, very interesting stuff.
Well, good. I hope everybody is still with us. And as you're still with us, that you can see we are on an intentional journey. So let me try to quickly contextually set up where we are, kind of moving from episode 1 to now. I'm not going to call it the episodes, but so what we're looking at is my contention that we are a nation and a culture in crisis, that the data is very clear, and so hence my title of what we've been saying: we're unmoored, we're like a boat loose in water, away from a safe harbor, no longer on any kind of a stable foundation. That you can see the evidence of this everywhere. The data is overwhelmingly clear, from the Surgeon General to various, study groups like Gallup or Barna who do data search information, national reports, global reports for the United States. The evidence is, seemingly really bad. So like, wow, we're in a really tough spot. Like why are we there? And I think it's because we have forgotten both the clues and the lessons of history. So we don't know our history, and in the process, we've somewhat abandoned that foundation, including a foundation of the uniqueness of the country. And in that uniqueness, up until this moment, generally stated that there's this pretty solid potential for flourishing. Not that it was great or perfect for everybody. The United States, or the setting in the United States, it wasn't. But that's our civic foundation. And within that civic foundation, and at root to all of our issues, is a spiritual dimension. There's an aspect that is an interior issue, meaning it's not who we elect, it's not who we vote for. I mean, those can be important things. I usually vote in all the elections, but that's not where our answer comes from. And when you look at our history, a necessary component in the mix was Christianity. We're not back to U.S. history foundation yet. We're kind of building in that direction. And so that we've forgotten all of our history and the why of that history. It's certain in the sense of like, well, why was this what our founders thought? And next episode, we're really going to dig into the first colonists who, 150 years predate the kind of civic founders of the country. So why'd they have that position? So in the mix of that tension, I propose that there are 2 groups who are striving and have been striving at least since maybe the 80s, maybe the 70s, the 1980s, 1970s, over how to save or preserve the country, so that they would both say, hey, I think everybody would agree, yeah, there's a problem, and yes, we should fix it. I think that's generally, where people land. And so one group is this kind of conservative group that is perhaps mostly made up of Christians who will say that they believe in Jesus Christ and this whole focus for them, so conservatives who are Christians. And then the other side would be progressives, or people who, some of them would be Christians too, by the way, but others who would say, yeah, I don't think Christianity is necessarily all that important, or maybe even it itself is bad, and pursuing the path that group wants to pursue is negative. It'll be a negative impact to our society. So the 2 groups then are fighting over, well, what is the best worldview that would guide us. And again, I'm suggesting both groups, or really the whole of the country, has forgotten its history. In how then we look at a spiritual dimension of our foundation. All right, so does that all make sense? That seemed like a good, you were here for the ride, so does that sound right?
forget your history, then you forget who you are, and nothing good can come from that.
Yeah, and so then the last two episodes, the last episode, as you said, we dealt with Constantine. So go one before. We looked to see there was another time when there was a group of people who said that we think we're God's chosen people, and yet they went from majority culture to minority culture. And so we examined some ancient documents back into the 5th, 6th century BC to say, well, what was true for those people? Why did they have this situation by their own accounting where they had failed to kind of follow along with what God demanded of them, the Jewish God. And remember, for the listener, the Christian God and the Jewish God is the same being, based on what they say. No, Jewish people, that's their faith, would disagree with that. But from a Christian point of view, they would say it's the same thing. And then, as we've noted, the fact that you have the people who claim to be God's chosen people moving from majority to minority at their own causing, their own failing to accomplish the things that their God has demanded of them, matches the same data that we also looked at back in episode, kind of 1 and 2. So we were looking at that, one, to kind of alert the conservative Christian crowd that rather than looking for someone to blame or perceiving that somebody has done something to you, it's actually a time to look in the mirror. There's a hint there also, which we'll come back to later in another episode, about a solution. How then do I live if I'm in the minority culture? But we didn't get to that point in great depth. So then we looked then to see that idea of the faith in minority culture actually was the reality for the first 3 centuries of those who follow and believe in Jesus. And so that all was true until the coming of Constantine. So last episode, we kind of looked at what happened. And we noted that when there was this movement for the Christians to become the majority culture, the dominant culture, it ended up having a negative impact on the faith itself. And we spent a little bit of time, we're going to spend more today, a little bit of time in that episode talking about, well, what was Christianity like as a faith pre-Constantine? And then we looked at what happened post-Constantine. And again, the point there would be to say to current conservative Christians who think, or who seem to be saying, at least in my hearing, that the solution we need is some sort of a Christian takeover. If we elect the right people or get the right laws passed, we can kind of have a return to some glory days of Christianity as the majority culture in the United States. And that is a version of what we call Christendom when we look back as historians into this early, say, 3rd, 4th century AD through at least 1,000 years, maybe more, depending on who's doing the counting. And that didn't work out well. Right. And so we kind of covered that ground there. And so that's the last 2 episodes. Now that all leads to this question, I think. A person could say, well, it sounds like Christianity is a bad idea.
All right. Tried, found wanting.
Yeah.
What's next?
Yeah, they didn't do what their God said. And then when they got to be in charge, they were jerks. It was terrible. Okay. So that's actually the end of the podcast.
Plot. It took a turn.
Okay. No, exactly. Right. So why not? And that's what we need to look at today. All right. So let me take you to American history to kind of build the why not. Let me start off with something that you probably have heard before. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pop quiz, do you know where that's from, Matthew?
That is from the Declaration of Independence.
Very good. First drafted by Thomas Jefferson, edited by Ben Franklin and John Adams. Jefferson, who most people would say not a Christian, not even really a deist. I don't know if that's true or fair. We're not talking about whether Jefferson is or isn't. Capitalizes the Creator. So Google it, check it out. That's not something that's a late addition. Of those 3, John Adams would have been the most Christian of the 3. It wasn't like John went in and said, we need to capitalize Creator. So that was a choice that Jefferson made.
Seems self-evident, you might say.
Right. So he's applying creator there to be kind of God. But what I really want you to dive into is this. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, just for a second, not to put you on the spot, but when something seems self-evident, what is that? What do you think that means?
It's a fancy word for saying duh.
Right.
It goes without saying, but I'm going to say it.
Right. Here's the key. Nobody on the planet in 1776, or very few people on the planet in 1776, would have said those were self-evident truths.
Are they not wanting to do the legwork of making the case? They're like, no, we're just...
Exactly.
They're like, Google it. Moving on.
Moving on. We think these are self-evident. Now, there's a whole bunch of questions that we will look at. We're going to have a whole episode on the Declaration. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to discuss right there. And there are some writers and thinkers from England in the 1600s, and even a little before that we're going to take a look at that kind of help us with that concept. But the point is, particularly when you go back to antiquity, where we've left off, nobody would have said that there was an endowment from the Creator. Nobody would have said that they had rights, that these were unalienable, meaning you can't argue about these. Nobody would have said that the individuals have a right to life. Nobody would have said you have a right to liberty. And they certainly would not have said you have a right to pursue happiness. So this raises some serious questions for us. If you and I are standing back in the BC time period or the early AD time period, we go back in Doc Brown's DeLorean and we're kind of talking our way through this with people. We're saying, hey, don't you think you have some rights? They'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. This concept of right. Now, at certain places, in certain moments, you would have found certain individuals who would have made claims to their citizenship. So we could say that's a version of rights. And yes, for my academically and historically astute listeners, yeah, there's some singular moments when you can point to. But in general terms, few people would have agreed that these were self-evident concepts. And you would have found very few like writers or thinkers in support of this idea. If you go back and look at somebody like Plato or Aristotle, who the Greeks are obviously massively important for Western civilization, for the understanding of the brain and the thinkers and philosophies, there's no kind of concept in their writings of kind of rights and liberties for all.
So this is not just unique historically. It's unique contemporaneously because these were not widespread ideas that, everybody's kind of been talking about around the world, and we're kind of codifying it. And this really is kind of singular.
Which again, go back, I think it was episode 1 or 2, and I made the point that what the Americans had created was a unique country. There certainly were some antecedents. And then people may look at, say, the French Revolution and then other revolutions in Europe in the 1800s that are happening. But those are, in essence, to some degree, copying us. So what the Americans were doing was unique. And it's a massively bold claim. I mean, it would have been one thing if he'd have said some version of, hey, we're going to do something different. And we believe that the individual has life and liberty, right? And by the way, for the person who's screaming at the radio right now, yes, I'm aware that it's Jefferson writing it while he has people in slavery. So again, there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about, like, well, wait, what was he thinking he was claiming? And is this really a pro-USA positive statement? Aren't we really just massive hypocrites? And to some degree, yeah, absolutely. There's some hypocrisy, certainly in people like Jefferson, who's the loudest about saying this kind of stuff that, rights for people or individuals should have rights. And what about women and all this kind of, so I'm not glossing over that. It's just not the focus right now.
Right.
But there was a uniqueness to what the Americans were creating. And so then you can say it's unique at that moment and unique throughout history. You can look back at some places and some people groups in almost random moments and say, well, they had something similar to us. And we noted those, say, for the Athenians or for the Roman Republic. And there's a few others, I know. But when you talk about them, say, in my classroom, it's like you're noting these are the oddballs. These are the weirdos.
Right.
This is not like the normative state for the human that then some evil dictators come along every so often and screw everything up and take things away from us. As I said, like from a governing point of view, the normative state is that kind of power pyramid with a single leader or a small powerful group on top, and nobody has any rights. You're lucky to be alive, and the king or the emperor or the person who's in charge can pretty much do what they want, and you have no ability to perceive, to go for a redress, to try to say, hey, I think this is unfair and I want you to fix this kind of a thing. So our question then is, well, somehow this had to happen. And I think this, if the last two sessions have been aimed at my conservative Christian friends, this episode more than any is probably aimed directly at my more progressive friends, so listeners who are here, who are saying, again, well, maybe we should just get rid of Christianity. It's like, nope, that's not the case. Because what we begin to examine when we say, like looking at the preamble or the first parts there, not preamble, the first parts of the Declaration, like why would they make this statement? Like what's changed that leads us to this place? They're asking for rights, and often in the tension between, say, the progressive and the conservative, there's a question of the conservatives trying to limit rights. They're trying to harm somebody's liberty of expression of their identity, or the progressive might have more vocal concerns about voting rights. Everybody should get a chance to participate, in the society. These rights were unknown in antiquity, and they were unknown in the 1700s. So we want to say, well, why? And the answer, the short answer, spoiler alert, is that, as Tom Holland said, Tom Holland's a historian who by his own admission was an atheist, but he began doing some examination about European history. And he said this, he said, we live in a society that is utterly saturated with Christian assumptions. And as he began to examine it, he began to say, wow, I did not realize Christianity was so vital to things that I hold as crucial to a flourishing or positive society. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I know we're kind of going to get into, and it's very eye-opening. So yeah, this can be good.
So let's look at two ancient documents before we do some summarization. The first one is from a Roman official whose name is Pliny. And he was an official. He was the governor of basically over in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, around the year 112. And the city area of Pontus, but again, he's on the Black Sea coast, and he is the official there. He's kind of the governor in charge, and he's reaching out to the emperor. And my mind went totally blank. Trajan. He's writing at the time of Emperor Trajan. And so he describes to the emperor a series of interactions he's had with Christians. There's a moment where it's not really clear in the letter like why specifically he's having arrest and investigations, court cases, and in some cases moments of torture to extract information. It's not one of the times that we typically look at as an official persecution of Christianity, like with Nero, or like we talked about last time about Diocletian. It's not really one of those moments. But he's kind of writing, and he's writing the emperor for advice. He's like, hey, this is what I've done. Does this sound good to you? Are you okay with this? And he begins describing the early church. And now he's noting this as this kind of weird aberration, right? So he goes through a process of torturing a couple of leaders, both of whom happen to be women. So we made this point last time that women were in the early church considered leaders. And he says, they believe this viewpoint that he calls it's a madness. He considers it a dangerous contagion for the society, which is part of why he's having these people arrested and in some cases executed. He calls it a secret society, which was illegal, and he kind of alludes to something that Trajan, these are illegal secret societies, so we're supposed to stop them, right? And so he says, here's what they do. They have a gathering. They seem to do some version of worship. They take a loyalty oath together. It's not an oath to bind them to do something criminal, but instead it's an oath to not commit fraud with each other, to not steal from each other, to not commit adultery, And again, by him pointing these things out, you should be able to clearly go, so those should not have seemed unique, except that they were unique,
right,
amongst Roman people.
Right.
They have a loyalty oath to not break their promises, and if they were given something to hold in trust for the group, then they would give it back if they needed to, or they would use it well, basically, which links into what we said. The early church was focused on. There's an ancient document from one of the really the best historians for the first century, who was a physician man by the name of Luke, and he writes that in the very, very beginning that these Christians held all things in common. And then he later talks about how different individuals would sell possessions so they could turn that into cash and give that cash to the church leaders so that no one would have any needs kind of whatsoever. So Pliny here is noting that. He's like, hey, they kind of seem to share their resources in a way that seems rather odd to him. And he describes their worship service. And he says this group is growing. In fact, he noted a concern that the normal temples of worship were not well attended. But he feels like by the steps he's taking, there's been a reversal. So because we're persecuting these people, some people have come back to the good official worship, including the worship of the emperor. So that's a positive. Right. And he had also noted that the Christians had an economic negative impact because there was an industry of preparing animals for sacrifices to the various gods, and they had a downturn because people had quit purchasing these. So we're just looking at this, just really decide to say, here's who these kind of people are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear an extra biblical documentation of the early impact of this group of people.
Yeah, and if you read it, some of the people who were arrested are they recant. They're like, "Yep, I'm not with those Christians." And they had a moment where they had to. See if I got it. I've got the document right here, at least a copy of the document that when he had them, he interrogated them. And where was the? I wanted to see it. Oh, I'm not going to find it fast enough. That they had to deny that they were with Christianity. And they promised that they would worship your image, the image of the emperor, the statues of the god, and they had to curse Christ.
Oh, wow.
So some did. So they said, yep, I'm not part of that. And again, because some were being executed, some were being arrested, some were being tortured. Right. So you kind of get this sifting out of kind of who's going to be in the game and all this kind of stuff. But we look at this letter to note he's positioning these people, these weirdos, and what were they weird about? Well, like for instance, one was they didn't commit adultery. They didn't lie. And if they were given things of value to hold economically, they did that well. Now, I don't think it's fair to say, obviously, every Roman must have lied. Every Roman must have committed adultery. And if they were given us some value, they stole it. I don't think that's the case. But the fact that he notes these things would certainly suggest
some kind of contrast for some reason.
He's seeing it as this weird kind of thing. And he basically is asking the emperor, give me some insight. We do have the emperor's letter back. It's really short, and he basically commends him, and he says, hey, yep, that's right. The one thing he says is, don't do anything to someone simply because of a false witness. Like if somebody has said to them an anonymous accusation, don't work on that. So again, this is, I think, one of the ways we could say it's not really a formal time of persecution. It's just, I got this group, they worry me, they're a little weird, and it's economically impacting my region, so I've taken these steps. Are you good with this? And the emperor's like, yeah, these guys are weird freaks. We kind of need to be aware of what's happening. Again, they're growing. This is early 2nd century, so again, 112. All right, the second document is an anonymous document, right? So it's called the Letter to Diognetus, and we're not sure if that's a dude's name. Most historians say it is, so they think it's an official. There's a lot of historians who their field is obviously in Roman history, so they've tried to track this guy down. It is possible that word means heaven born, so it is possible that it was actually him writing to the emperor, which at that time the emperor would have been Hadrian. We're not sure, so it's written somewhere around 150. So about 120 years. If it's to Hadrian, it's earlier than that. It's closer to like 124, 125. So it would be right after the Pliny letter. So Diognetus is talking, and he is a Christian from what we can tell, or at least he's posturing himself as one. He's posing as one. And he's noting various things. He's basically explaining the Christian faith to Diognetus, or to the emperor if it's this. So it's a rather long letter. You can, I have a copy here. You could find a copy and read it. Google it, obviously. Diognetus is, I've already lost that spell. If you want to see it, I'll be in the show notes, but Diognetus. So in this, he's noting that Christianity is increasing day by day. Even though there is persecutions, he says this, Christians, quote, are thrown to wild animals to make them deny the Lord, and yet they are not vanquished. They're not vanquished in their faith. So there are people being persecuted, but they're sticking with it. Then one of the things he describes to Diognetus is that the believers, quoting now, share meals with their neighbors, but never the marriage bed. So when you say, well, what's going on with that? Well, they were trying to avoid sexual scandal because they knew that sexual purity was something that Christianity and the teachings of Jesus had demanded. And this is seen as extraordinarily odd. Another Roman philosopher, a guy named Galen, he had noted that he was impressed with this group he was watching. He does not become a Christian because, quote, they had restraint in cohabitation. So again, the normative state, obviously something's going on there. And so Diognetus was explaining, and others were noting, when you look at these guys, these Christians, there's something that stands out about how they are approaching sexuality, treatment of women, marriage. We're going to dig into this more in just a minute. They were pushing back against the traditional or normative society, which was definitely true for Rome, but would have been true in other settings where it was male-dominated, and in that male-dominated situation, you could have sex with pretty much whoever you wanted to. In fact, there were parties that were noted at different times where it's kind of gross, so everybody get ready. You'd go to this party, and sometimes it was a party that the emperor had put on or some high-ranking nobles. So nobles were there with their wives who also were nobles. But in the journey of this party, which might be a multi-day party, any male, including a lower-ranked person within the social structure, could basically have sex with any woman present. And no questions asked, including the emperor's wife or wives. So it wasn't like, oh, she's off limits. It's like, nope, she's always hot. I always kind of wanted to be with her.
Wow.
And you could just make it happen.
There it is.
And that was expected.
Yeah.
It was assumed. Well, these weird Christians, they're not sharing their wives. And they don't seem to be not only not sharing their wives, but the males don't seem to be trying to pursue other women themselves. So back to the Pliny's noting, they're not committing adultery. Like, that's weird. Because why would you not want to have sex with as many people if it was allowable as you possibly could? It should be noted for most Romans that probably 60% of the Roman society lived at what we would call like low middle class or even close to poverty level. They lived in massive apartments. So the point of that, just to say, there's no hiding kind of their lifestyle. Some of us have lived in apartments or in dorms back in college days, so you kind of know what that's like. But even our apartments, we kind of have this viewpoint of personal privacy, personal space.
Right.
That's not really their story. It's not really their focus as to how they perceive things. So when you live in an overcrowded apartment, everything's visible. Choices about a variety of things are going to be very clear. And so the letter to Diognetus is really trying to point that out and just admit it on the front side, that this is something you can know about these people. All right, so there's kind of two documents that kind of walk us through, which leads us to kind of make some conclusions as we're kind of going along. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Okay. Well, if you were to sum up this change and kind of maybe to some degree link back to Jefferson and the Declaration, for me, it starts with, from a sense of how do I know this difference is what Christianity says about the individual human and that individual human's worth as a person. So certainly when you look at a variety of early people groups, if you were one of us, if you were in the tribe, there was a likelihood that you might have value to the tribe and thus would be considered worthy of, say, respect or inclusion. But you also find in those same settings not only an exclusion mindset to people who were not part of the tribe. So you're not from our city, so you're not one of us. But also, even within the city, a kind of secondary status for people who were not of a certain level. Not always economic, but often economic. So that you don't have a valuation of all the humans. People are treated differently based on the perception by that culture, how that culture viewed things. And so here come the Christians, and here comes Jesus saying, that's not the way I want it to be. And they follow Jesus, obviously. And he's suggesting that every human breathing has agency, has potential, has promise. In other words, Jefferson, to some degree, is leaning back to Jesus to get this idea that you have a right to life and liberty, because that's not the way it was experienced. And it certainly wasn't experienced even in the Middle Ages for most people. It's interesting, if you read Nietzsche, this is one of the places where he really takes Christianity to task, thinking it's a terrible thing. This is quoting from his writing, Will to Power. Another Christian concept, no less crazy, the concept of equality of souls before God. This concept furnishes the prototype of all theories of equal rights. And again, for Nietzsche, this is crazy. This is a terrible idea to say that every human has rights. Does that make sense there? I mean, I just kind of want to sit on this for a second, because I think this is everything else hinges off of this.
Yeah, and in the context of the Roman culture, and again, this is a deductive thing, not I'm completely unburdened by knowledge. But you've got this class system, and where poor people are considered, that's to be a judgment. You're not supposed to have compassion. It almost, I wonder if the dynamic was something like where all of a sudden Christians show up, and for somebody who's on the bottom rung of society, there's somebody below me now. I just curious to know if something like that happened, to go like, oh my gosh, I'm not the bottom rung anymore. I'm poor, but at least I'm not a Christian.
Yeah.
So it's like everything was arrayed against them.
I'm certain that was happening too, but probably the bigger outcome was that poor people flocked to this. Initially, you could see, Jesus himself said a version of, you're blessed if you're poor. Now, he explains that out. There's some spiritual aspects to that, and there's a couple different ways where that's stated by him at different points by the people who tell us about his teachings. But nobody had said that before, because as you said, in most societies, if you were poor, that is evidence you've been cursed, or you've been neglected, or you've somehow borne the brunt of a judgment from the gods. And here Jesus was like going, no, that's got nothing to do with anything. And he talks a lot about his expectations about how people would act in that. This idea of the worth of the human is for me the central, most vital concept of what Christianity offers to the world. Now, yes, for someone who says, wait, I know of other religions or I know other philosophies, I can see some of those principles in some of those places. Okay, depends on which one we want to talk about. Yes, maybe. But the impact of Christianity in this, in the working out of this, is central to the upheaval, really, of what was the normative state for the human. No other possible philosophy or teacher had the impact that now some maybe later, you can think of somebody like Gandhi and his impact, or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the impact. Absolutely. But they're post-Jesus, right? And to some degree, both would confess to be leaning on Jesus and his ideas. This one is, everything else I'm about to explain in brief, all center on this. Because going back to the Declaration, if I don't think all humans have this standard, that we're all equal here as beings, then no, I don't think that everyone is endowed with the right to life. I think there's a valuation story. So those people I want to have life, those people I don't care about. And even to the point, perhaps, depending on who's saying it, to even taking their life from them. Because why should I care? Maybe they're taking up too much oxygen. Maybe they're an embarrassment for some reason. Or the idea of liberty. Like the concept of liberty for an individual, meaning, and to some degree, you could say Jefferson's meaning liberty from the state, and you're right. But why do I think that? Well, I think that only because of the Christian concept that the human has agency, has purpose, has potential, and there's an equality amongst them in the sight of, they would say, their God.
It's so interesting because, like you said, we've talked a little bit about it. We'll talk a little bit more where it's the behaviors that stand out that are in stark contrast. But you can't lose sight of the fact that there's some underneath there, some underlying belief that animates all of this. That's the nucleus of the whole thing. And you've just said it. And it's a transformative idea, obviously.
You can see that expanded to maybe the second point that I think is worth really digging into here, and that is that for Christianity, I'll make sure I say this right. I think this is, I'm fair, I'm safe on this one. That Christianity is the first, and maybe not only it's not fair, but at that time, faith religion that was not linked to a society, to either a bloodline, to an ethnicity, to a civic location. Like, I'm this because I live here. Now, again, we said it's going to become that, tragically. And you know, today, in fact, there's times when, if you study the history of, say, the spread of Christianity, there's places where Christianity were in first, became forgotten, returned then by Europeans, and you'll have people in those places thinking, well, Christianity is a quote unquote white man's religion.
Right.
When it's like, no, absolutely not. Mostly because it was actually in this land that we're standing in now before it was ever in say white quote unquote Europe, but also no, because of how it's expressed by Jesus. He is coming initially to his own people as a Jewish person. But there's also this idea of the expansion of anybody can be in this. Anybody can walk in this setting because God is offering this solution to the problem of the human to everybody. And so, for instance, we mentioned last time that one of the writers, a man named Paul, who was one of the lead speakers, I guess, for Jesus, you know, he describes when he's writing to the churches in Galatia that the only thing that matters is your personal faith connection to Jesus, not your race, not your economic status, not your sexuality. There's no divisions or there's no limitations. This is revolutionary thinking. It's not a matter, so back to Diognetus, right? He described it this way. He said that the faith is not quoting now, is not a matter of nationality or language or customs. It's literally open to anybody. And that just was unheard of at the time. I mean, obviously today, particularly with the world becoming much smaller, you could see how anybody could become something, a variety. Think of one of the different world religions that you know. If anybody wants to be a Buddhist, they can become a Buddhist. Anybody wants to be a Hindu, they can become a Hindu from a worship point of view. And you can think of all the different kind of philosophies of life because we are a much smaller world through technology and those kinds of things. But at the time, all the gods and religions were location specific and race, ethnicity specific. And there's also this idea of, and you get this from the same, again, back to the ancient document, there's no forcing. This, again, is kind of links back to Constantine, or not Constantine himself, but to what happened post-Constantine. So Diognetus said this, that God was sent by, Jesus comes, and yet what God was trying to do through Jesus was trying to save humans by persuasion, not by compulsion. For compulsion is not God's way of working. And again, if you think of I'm born here, so then because I'm born here, this is what I got to deal with. Well, I think that ends up being a compulsive kind of way. And, you and I grew up in families that Christianity was vital, and we have other friends who were baptized as infants, and so they just kind of are always in that setting. And you and I were in churches when we were infants, even though our churches didn't necessarily baptize somebody, bring you in, quote unquote, through some mechanism. So there's a sense where you may grow up going, I didn't get a choice. And that's a version of compulsion. And I'm not saying my parents shouldn't have done this for me, but I'm just saying that what Diogenitus is saying and what the teachings of Jesus is that this is a choice you get to make whether or not you want to be included in this. Yeah.
Again, contrast to every other religion and cultural force.
Let me end with one more quote from the letter of Diogenitus. Any foreign country is a motherland, and any motherland is a foreign country. Now, this touches on this idea then of where is my central loyalty? And my central loyalty is not to, quote unquote, where I was born or the nation that I live in. As a believer, my loyalty is to what I perceive to be my king or my leader, which is Jesus, pointing to God. This idea of faith that is not restricted is kind of a vital aspect of where we need to go. I think that's a good place for us to stop for this episode, because we're kind of introducing this concept that there's some more things that I really want us to look at, not in some way to kind of glorify Christianity. There's a whole other thing that I really want to talk about. I'm trying to figure out the right time to do it about end result, maybe it'll be the final episode. But for now, all I want to argue is that if the Americans have set up this structure that has Christianity embedded in it, someone could fairly say, well, why? And what we want to note, right, and we've done this at least in a broad setting and looking at some ancient documents, that Christianity brings something to the table that changed the world. And that cannot be or should not be easily dismissed or pushed away in the early 21st century, even though someone might say, yeah, but all the Christians I know aren't doing this well. That's a whole nother conversation, which we can maybe touch on later. But I think we're going to stop right there for now. Hopefully that made some sense. I'm not sure if I did a good job on this episode. You with me? You feel like we're okay?
I'm in it, man.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.